Okay, good morning.
Yes, decided.
Welcome to the Teachers Retirement System of the City of New York Investment Meeting for Monday, April 8th, 2019, a rare Monday meeting. So with that, Patricia, please call the roll.
John Adler.
I am here.
Thomas Brown.
Here.
Natalie Green Giles. Giles, thank you. Giles. David Kazansky.
Present.
Lindsay Oates. Deborah Penny.
Here.
Susanna Vickers.
John Dorsett for Controls Constraint.
We do have a quorum.
Okay, thank you. So with that, let me please welcome our newest trustee, Natalie Green Giles, who is a panel for educational policy member appointed by the mayor to that seat. Just to refresh everyone's memory, the mayor has two appointments to the TRS board. One who is a PEP member and one who is not. So I am not, and Natalie is. So we welcome her to the board. She has been serving on the Board of Education Retirement System board since last year because she's on the PEP. So welcome, Natalie.
Thank you.
And we appreciate your presence and hope you find value in being part of this board, and I'm sure we will find value in having you on board. So. Okay, so with that, we will move into our public agenda and call on Rokaton to do what you do.
So we will begin with the performance report for the passport funds for the month of February. That should be on the top of everyone's handouts. At the end of, well, you'll recall for February, it was another strong month for markets, both in the U.S. and abroad, particularly in developed markets. In emerging markets, a little bit less so. The U.S. was up about 3.5% during February. Developed markets were up about 2.6%. And in emerging markets, for the custom proxy we use here, that was down by about 1%. That brought, all told, the year-to-date returns for the U.S. equity market up to about 12.4%. And actually, if you look at the last 3 months, so December, including January and February together, you actually have a net positive return. So that spoke to how strong the market's returns have been so far this year, erasing what we saw in December last year. At the end of the month, the Diversified Equity Fund had about $15.2 billion in assets. It was a good month for the fund, up about 3.1% in line with its hybrid benchmark. The allocation to non-U.S. markets, unfortunately, on an absolute basis, was a bit of a drag this month. But year to date, the overall fund is up about 11.5%. The underlying composites were all roughly in line with their own benchmarks, with the exception being the active composite. So far year to date, up by about 70 basis points year to date. Again, a short-term time period, but wanted to note it nonetheless. The balanced fund, with assets of about $390 million at the end of the month, that fund was up about 90 basis points and a year-to-date return of about 3.5%. The International Equity Fund with $157 million in assets, that was up about 2.25% for the month, with a year-to-date return of up positive 9.1%. The Inflation Protection Fund was up about 1%. Year-to-date, that fund is up about 5.5%, or just shy of 5.5% rather. And the Socially Responsive Equity Fund with about $220 million in assets, that was up a little over 3%, roughly in line with the market, and year-to-date that fund's return is up positive almost 11%. So I'll pause there. Are there any questions?
For Mike on the February report? Okay.
Okay, so March was another positive month across the board, where we did see a little bit of weakness in public equity markets was within the non-U.S. small cap space. Otherwise, we saw positive numbers from the U.S. equity market, up about 1.5%. Large cap developed markets up about 75 basis points. I mentioned the non-U.S. small cap down by about 0.5%, and emerging markets roughly flat for the month. That altogether, all told, the calendar year-to-date U.S. is up a little over 14%, and with March, the fiscal year-to-date return for U.S. equities were up about 4.7%. The diversified equity funds hybrid benchmark, calendar year-to-date, positive to the tune of about 13%. The fiscal year-to-date number there is positive about 3.3%. And then what we saw for the balanced fund benchmark, calendar year-to-date up about 4.8%, fiscal year-to-date up about 3%. I mentioned earlier non-U.S. markets, and then beyond that for the inflation protection fund, the underlying strategy there up about 85 basis points, and calendar year-to-date up a little over 6%. And the underlying strategy for the socially responsive equity fund, that was up about 0.5%, lagging the S&P. Calendar year-to-date up about 12%, and fiscal year-to-date up a little over 1%. So I will pause there, see if there's any questions.
On the market benchmark. Okay. So I think that is all we have for today for our public agenda. So at this point, a motion would be in order to enter executive session. Is there such a motion?
There is. I move pursuant to Public Offices Law, Section 105, to go into executive session for discussions on specific investment matters.
Thank you, Mr. Penny.
Second.
Oh, Mr. Knapp? No, who made the second?
John.
Oh, Mr. Dorsa.
Dorsa.
My hearing is going to hair. Thank you, Mr. Dorsa. Any discussion? All in favor of the motion to enter executive session, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All opposed, please say nay. Any abstentions? The motion carries. All right, we're back in public session. Susan, would you please report out of executive session?
Certainly. In executive session, 2 manager updates were presented. A presentation on an international equity strategy was received and discussed. Consensus was reached, which will be announced at the appropriate time.
Thank you very much. I believe that concludes our business for today. Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion? All in favor of the motion to adjourn, please say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, please say nay. Any abstentions? Motion carries. Meeting is adjourned.
Yay!